Welcome back to another episode of Kingdom Instruction, where we walk in the spirit and truth. And our currency is love, peace, and joy. I am your brother, ambassador, and son of the Most High Yahuwah. And today's lesson is Back to the Kingdom Part 4. Now, if you haven't watched the previous Back to the Kingdoms, please go ahead and do so you'll be able to catch up. And just understand that we're going through Matthew all the way to Revelations, and we're going through every verse that pertains to the kingdom. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. So we left off at Matthew 13:44, which is a short parable told by Yahusha. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. It highlights the supreme value of the kingdom, prompting joyful total sacrifice to obtain it. Key themes and interpretations. Supreme value. The kingdom of heaven is worth more than all earthly possessions. Joyful sacrifice. The man sells everything, not out of compulsion, but with joy because he recognizes the treasure's worth. Hiddenness. The kingdom may not be immediately obvious to everyone, functioning like a hidden treasure that requires discovery. Total commitment. True discipleship involves a complete voluntary commitment to Yahusha and Yahuwah. Cultural background. In the ancient world, it was common to hide valuables in the ground during times of war and instability, making the scenario realistic. Legal action. The man buys the field to legally acquire the treasure, reflecting a righteous approach to obtaining it. Pairing. This verse is closely paired with the parable of the pearl of great price, Matthew 13, verses 45 through 46, reinforcing the same message. Matthew 13:45. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls. Teaches that finding salvation and Yahuwah's kingdom is the ultimate goal of life, surpassing all earthly value. It illustrates that true wisdom lies in sacrificing everything to possess this supreme and valuable spiritual treasure. Key meanings and context. The merchant search represents people actively looking for truth, fulfillment, and ultimate purpose. The pearl of great price represents Yahusha. The gospel is the kingdom of heaven itself. It is portrayed as unique, rare, and unmatched beauty value compared to lesser pearls, worldly pursuits. The sacrifice. The merchant sells everything to buy one pearl. This signifies that entering the kingdom requires total commitment and the willingness to let go of material attachments to prioritize Yahuwah. Joyful exchange. The action is not viewed as a loss, but a gain, as the value of the kingdom far exceeds any sacrifice made. This parable, immediately following the parable of the hidden treasure found in Matthew 13:44, which we just read, highlights the supreme worth of the kingdom and the active pursuit of it. Matthew 13:47 states, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet that was cast into the sea and gathered some of every kind. This parable signifies that the gospel message reaches all types of people worldwide, but a final divine judgment will separate the righteous from the wicked at the end of the age. Key meaning and symbolism. The dragnet represents the gospel message spreading throughout the world, gathering people from all backgrounds. The sea symbolizes the world, often characterized by restlessness and turmoil. Some of every kind indicates exclusive nature of the gospel invitation, which is extended to everyone regardless of their past. The sorting, which is found in verses 48 through 50. The separation of good, which is righteous, and bad, which is wicked, unrepentant. Fish represents the end time judgment. The result, the good are kept while the bad are thrown into a furnace of fire, emphasizing the urgency and responding to the gospel. This passage echoes the parable of the wheat and the tares, emphasizing that while good and evil may exist together in the world now, a definitive separation will occur, resulting in judgment for those who reject Hamashiach, the Messiah. Matthew 13:52 describes a scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven as a householder, bringing out new and old treasures. This signifies that disciples should combine their knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, old treasures, with the new revelation of Yahusha's teaching and the gospel, new treasures, to understand and teach the kingdom. Key interpretations: the scribe and householder. Yahusha is describing a teacher or disciple who has been instructed in the gospel, transforming them into a wise steward of spiritual truths, treasures old and new. This represents the continuity between the old covenant, Mosaic law, prophets, and the new covenant, Yahusha's teaching. Application: disciples are encouraged to use both foundational, established truths and fresh spiritual insights to navigate life and share the gospel. The passage concludes the parables in Matthew 13, emphasizing that the kingdom brings a new understanding that fulfills rather than replaces the old. Matthew 16:19 signifies Yahusha granting Peter and the apostles spiritual authority to govern the church and declare Yahuwah's will. Keys represent the authority to unlock the gospel, which is found in Acts 2, while binding and loosing, referring to the declaring action forbidden or permitted on earth, already validated in heaven. Key aspects of Matthew 16:19. The keys, which are authority. The keys represent administrative and spiritual authority to manage the kingdom's affairs on earth. Binding and loosening. This terminology, common to Hebrew rabbis, means to forbid, bind, or permit, release, loose. Heavenly validation. The phrase shall be bound, loosened in heaven indicates that the apostles' decision, guided by the Ruach HaKodesh, would align with Yahuwah's predetermined will rather than them creating their own rules. Opening the kingdom. Peter used these keys to open the doors to the gospel to the Hebrews at Pentecost, Acts part 2, chapter 2, and to the Gentiles, Acts 10. This authority is primarily exercised through preaching the gospel and directing the church according to Hamashiach's teaching, not independent, infallible human authority. Matthew 16:28. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Is widely understood by scholars to refer to the transfiguration found in Matthew 17:1 through 9. It is promised that some disciples would soon witness a glorious glimpse of Yahusha's divine kingship. Key interpretation of Matthew 16:28, the transfiguration, primary interpretation. Just days after this statement, Peter, James, and John saw Yahusha in his divine glory on the mountain, which is considered a foretaste of his kingdom, resurrection, and ascension. Yahusha's victory over death and ascension to the right hand of Yahuwah demonstrate his kingdom authority. The day of Pentecost, the empowering of the way, which is what the people used to be called, through the Ruach HaKodesh, marked the active and invisible coming of his kingdom on earth. Destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70. Some interpret this as the judgment upon the old covenant, confirming Yahusha as the reigning king. Contextual meaning. The verse follows Yahusha discussing the cost of discipleship, taking up the cross, and the future glory of his return by promising they would see his kingdom power shortly. He encouraged them that his suffering and theirs was not in vain, as they would see the reality of his kingship. Matthew 18:1 marks a turning point where disciples, driven by pride, ask, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Yahusha uses this to counter worldly ambition, teaching that true greatness lies in humility, servitude, and becoming dependent like a child rather than pursuing power or status. Key meaning and context: the disciples' misconception. The disciples were arguing over rank and power, thinking the kingdom in earthly political terms. The answer: humility. Yahusha answers in verses 2 through 4 by placing a child in their midst, indicating that to be great is to be humble and powerless, living at the mercy of others rather than seeking authority. Childlike faith. This means turning away from self confidence and pride to completely rely on Yahuwah, similar to how a child depends on a parent. The shift in value. Yahusha reverses worldly standards, placing the most vulnerable, symbolizing by a child, at the center of the community, stating that welcoming such a humility is equivalent to welcoming him. In essence, Matthew 18:1 sets up a lesson that in Yahuwah's kingdom, the least is the greatest, and one must be converted from self seeking to humble services. Matthew 18:3 says, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. This verse means that true entry into Yahuwah's kingdom requires a humble, dependent, and unpretentious spirit, similar to that of a child rather than pursuing greatness or status. Key meaning and context. Conversion. Unless you are converted, Yahusha emphasizes a drastic change in mindset, moving away from pride and self ambition, becoming like children. This refers to adopting the characteristics of a child, such as being humble, teachable, trusting, and acknowledging one's dependence on Yahuwah for everything. The context is of humility. The disciples had been arguing about who was the greatest. Yahusha used a child to illustrate that in Yahuwah's kingdom, the greatest are those who are not focused on self promotion, but on humble service. Significance: children in that era were considered powerless and insignificant. Yahusha flips this, showing that letting go of the need for worldly power and becoming like a helpless child is necessary for a spiritual life. In short, it is a call to repent of pride and to approach Yahuwah with a reliant, humble, and sincere heart, subconscious. Matthew 18:4. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Teaches that true greatness in Yahuwah's kingdom is defined by humility, not power or status. Yahusha uses a child to symbolize dependency, unconcern for social status, and trust. Key meanings of this verse include radical humility. In first century Hebrew culture, children had no social status, rights, or power. Yahusha instructs believers to adopt this same lack of self importance. The reversal of values. Unlike the world, which honors power and ambition, the kingdom of heaven honors those who are humble and dependent on Yahuwah. Childlike faith. This means relying on Yahuwah for everything rather than relying on one's own achievements, wisdom, or wealth. Context. The despite I'm sorry, the disciples were arguing about who was the greatest, found in Matthew 18:1. Yahusha reframes their ambition, stating that those who recognize their need for Yahuwah like a child are the truly great ones. In summary, Matthew 18:4 teaches that entering and leading in the kingdom requires a shift from self ambition to humble, trusting dependency on Yahweh. Matthew 23 introduces the parable of the unforgiving servant, where Yahusha compares the kingdom of heaven to a king settling accounts. It teaches that Yahweh, the king, graciously forgives the massive sin debt of humanity, and in turn, disciples are expected to extend unlimited, compassionate forgiveness to others. Key meaning and context. The context immediately following Peter's question about how many times to forgive, up to 7 times, Yahusha tells this parable to show that forgiveness should be limitless, 70 times 7. The symbolism: the king represents Yahweh, the servants represent people. The settling of accounts highlights divine accountability. The core message: because Yahweh has canceled an unpaid debt of sin for us, it is hypocritical and wrong to refuse to forgive the much smaller offenses others commit against us. The consequences: the parable warns that refusing to show mercy after having received such great mercy from Yahuwah results in judgment. The verse sets the stage for a lesson on radical grace and the necessity of extending the same forgiveness to others that we have received from Yahuwah. Matthew 19:12 explains that while marriage is the norm, some individuals remain unmarried, eunuchs, due to birth, human force, or voluntary choice to focus entirely on serving Yahuwah for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Yahusha teaches that voluntary celibacy is a special calling, not a command for everyone. Key takeaways on Matthew 19:12. Three types of eunuchs born that way: those with physical or natural conditions preventing marriage; made by men, those forced into the state, such as through forced castration or captivity in the ancient world; made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom, individuals who voluntarily chose celibacy, singleness, to devote their lives completely to Yahweh's service without the distraction of marriage. Voluntary celibacy: this is not physical self mutilation, but a figurative spiritual choice to abstain from sexual activity and marriage to serve Yahweh. A gift: Yahusha indicates this is a calling not given to everyone. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it, implying it requires a specific grace. Context: this statement follows a discussion on divorce where the disciples suggested it might be better not to marry at all if divorce is forbidden. Yahusha clarifies that both marriage and celibacy are valid, honorable paths for different people. In summary, the verse addresses why some are not married, affirming that choosing to remain single to serve Yahweh is a valid and a honorable life path. Matthew 19:14. But Yahusha said, let the little children come to me and do not forbid them, for such is the kingdom of heaven. Signifies that childlike faith, characterized by humility, trust, and dependency, is essential for entering Yahuwah's kingdom. Yahusha rebukes barriers to grace, emphasizing that the kingdom belongs to those, like children, rely completely on the Father rather than on personal merit. Key meaning and context: rebuke of obstacles. Yahusha corrects his disciples for trying to send children away, highlighting that no one should hinder anyone from coming to him. Childlike qualities: the such refers to characteristics of children: humility, trust, simplicity, and reliance, rather than intellectual, social, or spiritual credentials. Inclusive and grace, and grace. It highlights that Yahuwah's kingdom is accessible to all who come with a humble, open heart, regardless of status or perceived insignificance. Spiritual posture. This verse teaches that disciples must approach Yahusha with the same helplessness and trust that an infant has for a parent. The passage serves as a reminder to abandon pride and adopts a simple, trusting faith to enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 19:23. Then Yahusha said to his disciples, assuredly, I say to you that it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Highlights that wealth often creates a false sense of security and self sufficiency, making it difficult for the wealthy to rely on Yahuwah's salvation. Key meanings and contexts include context. Following the encounter with the rich young ruler who couldn't give up his possession, Yahusha emphasizes that the extreme difficulty of entering the kingdom for those who trust in riches. The problem with riches. Wealth can distort perspective, causing people to rely on material security rather than recognizing their spiritual poverty and need for Yahuwah. Not impossible, but hard. It is not impossible for a rich person to be saved, but it is challenging due to the tendency for riches to hinder spiritual dependency. Divine intervention, as explained in the subsequent verses 19:25 through 26, while salvation is humanly impossible for the self-reliant, it is possible through Yahuwah. This verse challenges the contemporary assumption that wealth equated to being blessed by Yahuwah, or that it made entering the kingdom easier. Matthew 19:24. And again, I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of Yahuwah. Uses the hyperbole to illustrate that salvation is impossible through human effort alone. It emphasizes that attachment to wealth hinders humility and reliance on Yahuwah. Key interpretations of this verse include human impossibility, the camel, the largest animal in the region, and the eye of a needle, the smallest opening, represent an impossible task. Yahusha is highlighting that, like the camel, a person relying on their own wealth, self-sufficiency, or works cannot enter heaven. The damage or wealth of wealth. Wealth often creates a false sense of security, pride, and self reliance, making it harder for the rich to humble themselves and feel their need for a savior. The need for humility. The verse reinforces that entering the kingdom requires the childlike humility, dependency, and surrendering that is often difficult for those who are accustomed to control and material security. Context of salvation. This statement immediately follows the story of the rich young ruler who could not part with his possessions to follow Yahusha, demonstrating that anything prioritized over Yahuwah, especially money, prevents true discipleship. When the disciples asked who then could be saved, Yahusha answered, with men this is impossible, but with Yahuwah all things are possible. Matthew 19:26, clarifying that salvation is a gift of Yahuwah's grace, not attained through wealth or personal merit. Matthew 20, verse 1, opens the parable of the workers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. It teaches that Yahuwah, the landowner, generously offers the same equal reward of salvation, kingdom, to all disciples, regardless of whether they serve him for a lifetime or come to faith only at the end. The key meaning and context, the vineyard and workers. The vineyard represents Yahweh's kingdom, and the workers represent disciples called to serve at different stages of life. The message of grace. The parable, Matthew 21 through 16, highlights salvation is a gift of grace, not a wage earned by labor. The last, those saved late, are made equal to the first, those saved early. The unfair generosity. The parable addresses the resentment of those who have borne the burden of and heat of the day. Verse 12. When others receive the same reward, it warns against envy and emphasizes that Yahweh's grace is sovereign and generous, not dictated by human standards or merit. Kingdom reversal. It fulfills the promise in Matthew 19, verse 30, that the last will be first and the first last, emphasizing that in Yahweh's kingdom, the focus is on grace rather than strictly on seniority or effort. This verse serves as a preamble to the story, illustrating that the kingdom of heaven is defined by a divine generosity, not by human merit-based compensation system. Matthew 20:21. The mother of James and John asked Yahusha to grant her sons the highest position, sitting at his right and left hand in his kingdom. This request highlights a misunderstanding of Yahusha's mission. Their viewing is a political kingdom rather than spiritual sacrificial one, and reveals this, a desire for power and status. Key details. The request. Grant that these my two sons may sit, one on your right and the other on the left, in your kingdom. Shows a desire for top authority, similar to being prime ministers in a royal court. Misunderstanding. The disciples, along with their mother, still believed Yahusha was going to establish a temporal earthly kingdom and were seeking positions of prestige, context, and ambition. This request follows Yahusha's prediction of his imminent suffering and death, highlighting a contrast between their desire for glory and the necessity of the cross. Yahusha's response. Yahusha responds by asking if they can drink the cup, referring to suffering that he is about to drink, indicating that greatness in his kingdom comes through service and sacrifice, not ruling over others. This verse highlights the human tendency toward ambition, which Yahusha redefines as humble service rather than worldly authority. All right, family, we're done for today. And until next time, thank you and shalom. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the post. And if you want to get in contact with me and have me create any videos or templates for you, please get in contact with me through these measures. Thanks again. Have a wonderful Shabbat. It's a beautiful day, as you can see, and we'll see you next Shabbat.